Tonight's event is an example of what Freeport Speech is striving to do. We want to bring important topics out to the attention of all of us, and we know that tonight's subject is difficult, complicated, and really important for all of us. There have been many forums already around the state on question 3, but tonight's is structured, highly structured, in a way where we hope to give a fair presentation of both sides based on fact and not opinion, and give you the resources to decide how you're going to vote. The key to the success of tonight's event is our moderator. Fortunately, it's not me. Jeff Thaler, who is of counsel at Pretty Flaherty, is a nationally recognized energy and environmental attorney. He's a Phi Beta Kappa magna cum laude graduate of Williams College and then went on to Yale Law School. He has moderated our two speakers tonight before, so this is not something new. And I have asked him to keep everything on track and not to hesitate to interrupt our speakers if they're varying from our agreed upon structure of the evening. Let me quickly outline it for you. First, each of the speakers will have 10 minutes with a PowerPoint presentation to present their point of view. Then Jeff will question each of the two speakers individually for 10 minutes each, going back to their presentations, both to clarify and to ask further questions. Then we will have each of the participants questioning each other. Rather than having to respond all the time, they'll have a chance to come back and they'll alternate specific questions. And then lastly, we'll have questions from the audience. We ask that during the time when we have the questions from the audience, that we alternate questions for one side versus the other. And please, one question per person, no follow-ups. This is not a debate. This is an informational evening. Finally, let me just ask you to all do what we hope to accomplish at each of our events. Listen to our speakers, think about what you heard, and then talk to each other in a civilized manner. And then finally, vote on November 7th. Thank you very much. Without further ado, Al Cleveland, representing the yes vote, the establishment of Pine Tree Power. Jim Cohen, representing the stay private side. And our moderator, Jeff Thaler. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. First of all, thank you all for coming tonight. This is really a key part of democracy. And 4 weeks from today is the election. There are 8 ballot items along with all the local and other matters. And we'll talk about the key one, question 3, but we'll talk very briefly on question 1 and 2, just so you know what they are as well. But ultimately, I teach at the law school some and college and grad school. The front row is always usually empty, so there are extra seats out front here. If anyone comes in late, they should feel free to be brought up front. I don't want to take any more time right now So we will start with the speakers. Anybody who knows me knows sometimes I'll go off script. So when I do my questioning, I probably won't do 10 minutes on one of you and 10 on the other, but I want to do it by issue, because if any of you have been getting mail lately or seeing the news, there are a lot of issues that have been brought up in the press and that are flying around both ways. Information, maybe misinformation. Tonight is to try to clarify as much as possible and to give you a chance to clarify for yourselves. So without further ado, Al, I think you're up.
Incredible. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Thank you for our host and the organizers who made this event happen. I've been so fortunate to be attending these forums and informational sessions all across the state, where week after week, I see dozens of Mainers who are hungry for information about question 3. Because those of us who have been paying a CMP bill are ready for a change. We've noticed our rates continue to go up, yet we are left with some of the most unreliable power in the country. And this November, we have an opportunity to change course. We've seen over the last 2 decades in Maine, our investor-owned utilities, Central Maine Power and Versant Power, be bought up by enormous energy conglomerates. Instead of providing us reliable, affordable energy, we have been subject to countless rate hikes, billing malpractice, watching money that comes from our rates being poured into political lobbying and campaigning. And yet, we know that CMP and Versant have not been working for us. Instead of giving us power that we can count on, we watch shareholders' returns, their profits, increase year after year. CMP and Versant took $187 million in profit out of Maine last year to send to their corporate shareholders in Spain, Calgary, Qatar, Norway. And at the same time, Mainers are struggling to pay their bills. The Public Utilities Commission approved a rate hike of 20% for CMP and Versant this July, while 94,000 disconnection notices were sent to our most vulnerable Mainers. That's over 10% of our state was unable to pay their bills, yet we continue to see corporate profits grow and grow. And so Mainers all across the state are asking the question, do we want to keep the status quo of investors owning our power grid? Or do we want to build a power company that truly works for us because it's owned by us? The investor-owned utility model has been successful for the last century at building a really fake regulatory system that doesn't actually hold our investor-owned utilities accountable. Let's go back to the early 1900s when electrification was spreading all across the country. Everyone wanted to figure out how they got a light bulb like Thomas Edison and figure out what does it mean to get power to their homes. And at that time, investor-owned utilities and consumer-owned utilities were pretty equally operating. We quickly learned that having competing poles and wires wasn't going to work. We actually needed a monopoly over our power system. So the investor-owned utilities poured millions of dollars into building the system we have now. And all over the country and here in Maine, people are realizing that that's not working for them. CMP and Versant are structured in a way that their primary goal is to take as much money from us as possible to leave our state. Both of our investor-owned utilities are currently owned by foreign governments and foreign corporations, and yet people in Maine, ratepayers, working people, businesses, have no control over something that impacts us every single day. And that's why this November we'll be voting on question 3. The ballot language that we'll be voting on reads, do you want to create a new power company governed by an elected board to acquire and operate the existing for-profit electricity transmission and distribution facilities in Maine? And we're here to say, yes, we do. See, we want to create the Pine Tree Power Company, a power company that's owned by us, the Maine ratepayers, a nonprofit, independent, consumer-owned utility that follows the model of consumer-owned utilities that is tried and true here in Maine, all across the country, at bringing affordable and reliable power, a utility that is ready to build the climate-resilient power grid we need for the coming years. We need a utility that actually works to save us money. But right now, our investor-owned utilities are guaranteed a rate of return around 9 to 12% for investments they pour into the grid, meaning millions of dollars are leaving Maine every year that could be going to building out a resilient grid and to saving us money. Independent Maine economists have shown that Pine Tree Power will save us $9 billion over 30 years. That comes out to $367 a year. I don't know about a lot of you, but I'm 25. I'm a working person here in Maine. That's a lot of money for me. That could be a rent payment. We've seen consumer-owned utilities in Maine and across the country deliver far better reliability. And here in Maine, we've got the worst power outages in the country. There's no reason that we have so much money leaving our state every year, yet consistent, unreliable power. This question that we'll be voting on has revealed a lot to people who didn't know that we allow corporations to have a monopoly over our electric grid. You see, this is not the free market when it comes to power. We don't have market protections helping keep our rates low or making sure we're provided good service. Central Maine Power was ranked dead last in customer satisfaction for the last 4 years in a row. We've got the worst utility in the country serving us, and yet a model for something that could work far better. Maine already has 10 consumer-owned utilities that serve 98 municipalities across our state. And those consumer-owned utilities here and across the country have rates that are far, far lower than what people who are paying to investor-owned utilities see. And that's because those utilities can access low financing revenue municipal bonds to fund their investments in the grid. Instead of paying that 9 to 12% guaranteed rate of return to the shareholders, we can access financing for 2 to 5%. This is how the Maine Turnpike Authority funds their projects. Utilities are the safest type of investment, and so we will be able to build out the grid that we need for the coming years at a fraction of the costs that it would have for the investor-owned utilities. This right here is a map. On the left side, you'll see where Central Maine Power and Versant Power currently are operating, and you'll see the existing consumer and utilities that I just described. The map on the right shows what the proposed Pine Tree Power Company territory would look like. Once we win in November, we will elect 7 members to the Pine Tree Power Board of Directors. They'll appoint 6 energy utility experts to join them in this board, and they will be responsible for building out a transition where we will acquire CMP and Versant and build a utility that we can count on, that we can hold accountable, a utility that is transparent.
2 minutes.
Thank you so much. Unlike the investor-owned utility model, who have boards with people we don't know, making ridiculous amounts of money, decisions and meetings that we are not allowed in, Pine Tree Power will be accountable to us. Pine Tree Power will be responsible for, it has a mandate in the bill to build a grid that works for working people and businesses with low rates, investments in reliable power, and our ability to invest in climate infrastructure that is necessary for the coming years. This timeline demonstrates what the process will look like. Once we win in November, it'll be 3 to 4 years until we can expect to start seeing savings on our bill. But most importantly for me, to be able to truly respond to the climate crisis that we're in. Anyone who is paying attention to extreme weather, to the growing impacts of climate change, is worried about what we're going to need in the coming years. We need to electrify our transportation and heating sectors because that's our only path towards meeting Maine's ambitious climate goals. Right now, 49% of carbon emissions in Maine come from transportation, yet our power companies are not ready for what it's going to look like to build out charging stations, batteries, the things we need to electrify transportation and heating. And even if they were willing, they would have to spend money at a 9 to 12% interest rate. With Pine Tree Power, we can access low interest capital.
Got 5 seconds.
Fantastic. I'm so looking forward to answering all of your questions, and thank you all so much for being here.
So I would just say one thing we forgot about was applause. And so I would say after Mr. Cohen speaks, you can applaud to keep it equal with Al. But after that, if we could hold applause on questions and answers and things like that, we'll be able to be more efficient. And then we can have applause at the very end. Jim?
Hold on one second.
That's okay.
Let me just...
We're all working off one laptop here.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Thanks all of you for being here. My name is Jim Cohen, and I'm here on behalf of Maine Affordable Energy, which is a coalition made up of organized labor, small and large businesses, over 12,000 Mainers, and we are opposed to question 3. And I want to talk to you a little bit about why we're opposed. I also appreciate the opportunity always to be in the town of Freeport. My mother served as the town planner in Freeport for many years. I somewhat followed in her footsteps by serving on the city council and as mayor of Portland 1 or 2 years ago. And I also have made my practice of law representing both consumers as well as consumer-owned and investor-owned utilities. So I think I have a unique perspective on many of the issues that are before us. Now, Al just gave a terrific speech. It strings together a bunch of, frankly, slogans and somewhat misleading information about the state of our electric grid today. And often, if you hear something that sounds too good to be true, it often is. Now, Maine voters are going to be voting on November 7th about something that is extraordinary. It's based on casting your vote, we're going to take over by eminent domain 2 private companies at a cost to us of what we estimate to be $13.5 billion, all in order to set up an electric system governed by politicians, most likely unqualified, who we don't know, and in turn hand over grid operations to a private for-profit company all over again that we don't know, and they're going to actually mark up their costs and charge us more. So first of all, what we're looking at is, contrary to what Pine Tree Power says, Question 3 sets up a utility ownership model that's only in place in 2 places in America, and that's Puerto Rico and Long Island. That's it. So every other example you've heard is not analogous. Now, it's important to understand that system in both Long Island and Puerto Rico have been unsuccessful, and if we pass it in Maine, we're going to be stuck with that system for a generation. Question 3, first of all, we heard a lot about for-profit corporations taking money out of the state of Maine, but importantly, their proposal doesn't get rid of for-profit corporations. In fact, the politicians of Pine Tree Power are required to hire a private for-profit company to operate our grid. According to a 2020 PUC study, that will cost us $82 million a year more in fees to do that. And most likely that company will be an out-of-state company and may even be a foreign company, and that money will leave Maine. Now, in Long Island, one of the examples, they have had several state commissions that have found a disregard for customers, a revolving door of executives going from the private sector back into the public sector, and now they are trying to change their model. Puerto Rico is currently bankrupt because of finger pointing between the public sector and the private grid operator. Their outages are measured in months. not days or hours. This is an unprecedented question. There are currently no statewide public power authorities, none. And no state has ever tried to take over a utility. This is on the local and community level. These are not statewide entities. In fact, in Maine, the trend is the opposite, privatization. And in 2017, Swans Island Electric Cooperative, a consumer-owned utility, was taken over by the predecessor of Versant, and their rates are now lower and their service quality is better. Let's talk about the system we have in place today for regulating public utilities. Now, Pine Tree Power claims that our utilities have a guaranteed rate of return, that our money leaves the state of Maine, and that we have no control. This is false. In Maine, our utilities are heavily regulated, and the kind of policies that question 3 calls for in terms of fair rates, in terms of quality service, consideration of the environment, that's already in law today. Our utilities cannot raise rates unless the government approves it after very detailed hearings. Those files are from my office from a rate case. It is substantial litigation. And once rates are set, utilities can and do lose money. There is no guarantee. Now, it's not, we've heard a lot about our utilities. It's not nearly as bad as Pine Tree Power wants to make out. Actual performance metrics suggest that our utilities are doing much better. Now, regardless, Governor Mills proposed, our legislature approved legislation in 2020. That legislation put in place 6 specific performance criteria. That criteria says if the utilities don't meet it, they can be substantially fined. If they continue to not meet that, they can have their franchise taken away. That is a substantial regulatory tool. And if we pass question 3, we actually lose that measure of control and we set ourselves back. Let's talk about risk. If we own Pine Tree Power, that means we, the people, are financially responsible for its losses. An unexpected storm that costs more, not covered by rates, that would fall to us. In Texas, when there was a cold snap and those utilities struggled to stay afloat and the power was out, the investor-owned utilities were literally able to weather that financial storm, but the consumer-owned utilities were placed on credit watch. One of them actually went bankrupt. In Maine, in Down East Maine, there's a consumer-owned utility called Eastern Maine Electric Cooperative. You saw it on the map earlier. That authority invested in Seabrook Nuclear Power Plant in the early 1980s. Because of extensive cost overruns, they went bankrupt. And when they went bankrupt, there was no shareholder to absorb that risk. 100% of that risk fell to the consumers themselves. The customers paid off debt in their bills for decades, having among the most expensive rates in Maine. What does Pine Tree Power not mean? Well, Pine Tree Power promises that without evidence, that there'll be better service, better rates, the environment will improve. But several weeks ago, our consumer advocate came out and said there was nothing in question 3, no guarantees that any of those things would come true. Let's talk about the environment. Nebraska is the only state in America that's predominantly public power, but that state is among the lowest in energy efficiency, among the lowest in grid modernization, whereas Maine is in the middle of the pack or better. Their fuel mix in Nebraska is among the dirtiest, with coal and nuclear predominantly, whereas Maine has among the cleanest energy mix in the nation. Let's talk about reliability. If you look at large consumer-owned utilities across America, on balance, they have the worst reliability compared to investor-owned. And right here in Maine, Eastern Maine Electric Cooperative actually, on average, has worse reliability than Central Maine Power. Let's talk about how long this will take. Our public advocate said several weeks ago, expect 5 to 10 years of process. On average, the few times that this happens, it has been 10 years on average. Long Island was 13 years of process. The difference is litigation. So unless you believe that a difference of several $billion will simply be swept under the rug, expect about 5 years of litigation. We're going to be 2030 before we know the value of our utilities. That's like writing a blank check in November of this year, waiting for the law court to fill in that blank check 7 years later. That's like buying a car without knowing what it costs not knowing whether it will run, saying, charge me whatever you want, and maybe in 7 years send me the bill. That's bad policy. That's what question 3 asks us to do. And we expect that it'll be a $13.5 billion cost. In Boulder, the legal fees for just one small city were $28 million. Expect many more times that, all of which will go onto our rates. Time is money from the takeover perspective. The longer it takes to take over, the more our utilities are worth, the more we have to pay. That's how we get to $13.5 billion. And that means your rates go up because $82 million a year of new costs for operation, debt service on $13.5 billion, that overwhelms any savings you get. That means your rates go up. That means your groceries are more expensive. That means your taxes go up because our government authorities also use electricity. So in the end, Governor Mills looked at this proposal and said, this is a rosy solution to a complicated problem, creates more problems than it solves. She worried about the delays getting in the way of our climate goals in unqualified politicians. Former PUC commissioners came out against this and said, the politicians that are in charge of Pine Tree Power are going to cave into political interests, and they're going to underinvest in reliability. They're going to underinvest in grid modernization. This is a promise that can't be kept. We're going to be voting on a structure that we're going to be living with for decades, and it's not the right answer for Maine. We need to let our system work, save ourselves the decade of litigation, save ourselves the $13.5 billion, and not put control in the hands of people we don't know. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you both very much. And now we're going to get into some questions and try to test some of the assertions that were made. Let me also just first start by saying that I mentioned at the beginning, this will only be one of actually 8 questions that will be voted on the statewide ballot. There are 4 constitutional amendments that I will not discuss, nor the car repair one, which is number 4. But numbers 1 and 2, just be aware, do have an indirect, potentially, effect on question 3, which is a separate question. The first question is, do you want to bar some quasi-governmental entities and all consumer-owned electric utilities from taking on more than $1 billion in debt unless they get statewide voter approval? That would be a new requirement. Question 2, also a citizen initiative. Do you want to ban foreign governments and entities that they own, control, or influence from making campaign contributions or financing communications for or against candidates or ballot questions? Probably won't see many forums on those 2, but they are relevant, and so you should educate yourselves on those. And number 3 is what we're talking about tonight, creating Pine Tree Power Company. And the question will read on the ballot, do you want to create a new power company governed by an elected board to acquire and operate existing for-profit electricity transmission and distribution facilities in Maine? So let me start off. I think one of the key issues that you've heard tonight, and probably if you're like me and you actually still get mail, you've gotten in the mail a number of flyers. One says $13.5 billion in debt and higher rates. That's what Mr. Cohen has talked about. Ms. Cleveland says no, maybe $9 billion lower rates. Jim, why the difference? Why $4.5 billion? How do you get to 13.5? Let me put it that way. When CMP and Versant's 2022 reports to the Commission, Public Utilities Commission, come out to about $6 billion in assets and debt.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, for the question. So the starting point is an analysis that the Public Utilities Commission undertook at the direction of the legislature, reported in 2020. And what that study said, done by London Economics International, is that a takeover of CMP and Versant would be only $8.2 billion based on certain assumptions. Now, they acknowledge that many of those assumptions we wouldn't know, and so to some degree, there's a great amount of uncertainty. So we simply took the Public Utilities Commission's own analysis and we said, first of all, will that takeover occur in 2024? Now, we looked at the timeline, even on the most optimistic end, we're into 2026. If you assume litigation, we're well into 2030, 2031, or beyond. And so time is money. Every year that goes by, there's new wires, new poles, new substations. That adds value. So you take the number that Jeff said and you start adding to it. The second thing is the multiplier of net book value. So in the mid-1990s, I worked on several cases involving small water utilities taken over by legislatively created charters, and the Maine law court said that the formula is a multiple of book value. So the question is, what is that multiple? Now, the PUC said maybe if it's 1.5, then the answer is 8.2 billion in 2024. But if you look at the most recent takeovers of other utilities, they have been on the low end 2 times net book value, on the high end 5 times net book value.
You're gonna have to wrap
So we simply estimated that there would be 2 times net book value in 2030. That gets us to $13.5 billion. And we won't know that until the law court actually declares that 7 or 8 years from now. We'll have to guess what's behind door number 3.
Thank you. Al?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I want to clarify that what we're talking about is savings, not cost. Independent Maine economists have predicted, even with the cost of us acquiring the utilities, we will save $9 billion over 30 years. And this is because we're moving from paying an absentee landlord's skyrocketing rents towards buying a house, buying long-term equity for our future generations, and paying a low-interest monthly mortgage for the cost of the utilities. As Jeff mentioned, the utilities have to report their worth every year to the federal authorities, and last year they reported a value of $5.4 billion. That's a lot less than the $13 billion we're seeing millions get poured into this campaign to misinform voters. The analysis that shows Mainers would save $367 a year is based off of the fact we would pay a 1.5 multiplier cost of the utilities. That's a high estimate because we have precedent here in Maine of what the multiplier for utility sales have been. When Emera Maine sold to Versant in 2020, they paid a 1.4 net book multiplier. That is based, we have to pay a fair market value according to the Constitution for the utilities. A fair market value for the worst in customer service company, for utilities that have repeatedly been fined by the Maine Public Utilities Commission for violating law, for utilities that have the worst outages in the country. We're certain it's going to be a lot less. We know as well from the Office of the Public Advocate that Maine can expect to see even more savings on the transmission side, a projected additional $4 billion that we would receive because we wouldn't have to share our transmission savings with other New England states.
And you have to wrap up, too.
This means that Maine's transition from paying $187 million in profits to investors we would be able to recoup those costs and build out a future grid where we have lower monthly bills.
Thanks. And just so the audience knows, we agreed ahead of time that I would say wrap up when I was giving them roughly 15 seconds on their 2 minutes, which is not a lot of time, I admit. So again, if you have follow-up questions, please do jot them down to remind yourself. Let's talk about management of Pine Tree Power. There's been debates in the newspaper, again in flyers, about whether we're talking about politicians taking over the Maine's electric grid. Al, I'll start with you on this one. That's the accusation or claim. How do you address that?
Yeah, I really look to John Clark, the former head of Holton's Consumer and Utility Power District, who said recently, I think in the Portland Press Herald, that there are dozens of qualified operators that would be able to take the private operations bid. You see, it was really important for the Pine Tree Power campaign and our coalition to make sure we could protect all worker jobs, for workers to maintain their union contracts, their right to strike, and all of the things they fought for in the union. And that's why it was written in the bill that the Pine Tree Power Company, the board of directors, would hire a private operator that would run the day-to-day management, meaning those jobs would stay in the private sector so the right to strike was maintained. This then gives us the ability to have a competitive bid, an RFP process where we can attract some of the best talent here in Maine and the region to be able to operate the day-to-day management of Pine Tree Power. We've seen this model being used in different places, being really successful. We also know that the way that the private operator would be able to function as at a fraction of the cost what we currently pay the investor-owned utilities. The investor-owned utilities make money because of capital investment. They'll put a lot of money in super high dollar projects like transmission corridors that don't really serve us. They don't make an operations profit. That's a really different system. And so moving from having this private investor-owned utility ownership to having public ownership with a private operator is how we save long-term $9 billion over those 30 years, but also so we can maintain the rights and the incredible workers that we know are serving us well. We're not interested in getting rid of the customer service reps or the line workers in Maine. We're interested in voting out their bosses in Spain and Calgary who are not serving us. Last year,
And you're going to have to wrap up.
Fantastic. Last year, CMP and Versant sent more in profits out of the state than they paid their entire workforce combined. This needs to change, and Pine Tree Power, question 3, is our way to make that change.
And Jim, when you respond, could you address, it seems like most of the campaign on your side is saying elected officials can't trust them. The New York State Commission on the Long Island Public Power Authority said that between elected and appointed boards, there's no correlation as to positive or negative performance. So why would you urge people not to trust the process that Pine Tree Power has proposed?
Yeah, let me start by just reiterating that this is a model that is used in only 2 places in America, and that is Long Island and Puerto Rico. But I'm actually going to start with Puerto Rico as an example, because one of the line workers for CMP who used to work in Puerto Rico told the Utilities Committee of the legislature this past year that one of the problems is when there's a storm outage and they're trying to figure out how to repair it, the politicians on the one hand say, this is all we're going to give you for the kinds of materials to respond. At the same time, the private grid operator is saying, well, we need something else. We actually need more equipment. And so there's finger pointing. And so the power stays out. When Superstorm Sandy happened in Long Island, there was a commission. What that commission found is that there was a revolving door of politicians going back and forth and lawyers and lobbyists between the public and private sector. Now, I've served in public office before, and it is very difficult to raise taxes for infrastructure. You can look out at our roads and bridges. We can do better. And what's telling is that consumer-owned water districts and sewer districts in Maine have come out against this plan. They themselves are government entities. But what they don't do is they don't trust that a statewide entity governed by politicians, where the only criteria to be one of these politicians is that you're 21 years of age and you live in the district that you're running from. We will have an opportunity to vote on only one member of that 13-member board. Imagine the money that comes in to elect the people who will be making important decisions. There is no guarantee. The Public Utilities Commissioners of the past looked at this and said, we have seen examples, including within our water industry, of underinvestment. So politicians are not intrinsically bad. I've been one, I'm a recovering politician. But we struggle within the environment we're in to try to make the decisions needed. We can't promise sitting here today that we know whether it will be a conservative board or whether it will be a progressive board. And every 2 years with election cycles, who serves on that board could change.
Jim,
so there's every reason
cut you
to think.
off. My mic wasn't working there for a minute, sorry.
Thank you.
I want to change to climate and renewables, and I'll start with you, Jim, on this one. Pine Tree Power has said they will be better on climate change. You've said the opposite. What evidence do you have that the existing owners of the grid would be a better alternative for achieving the climate goals that the governor has set, among others, and that the legislature has set?
Well, I think I'm going to start with what our consumer advocate said several weeks ago, that there was nothing in question 3 that assured that there would be any improvement in climate. So all we can really do is look for analogies around the country and around the state to have a guess as to what that might look like. Now, Nebraska, I mentioned earlier, is the only state in America that is predominantly public power. They happen to have one of the dirtiest fuel mixes. That's a large state. If you look within the state of Maine consumer-owned utilities, they've managed to exempt themselves from most of the net energy billing and long-term renewable energy contracts. Meanwhile, Central Maine Power and Versant Power advocated for net energy billing. They advocated against the decision of the legislature to cut back and retroactively have a moratorium on net energy billing. If you look at nationally, the trade association that represents large consumer-owned utilities, the rural electric cooperatives, they were all over Fox News this past summer talking about how they opposed the Biden clean energy plan. Why? Because they wanted to make sure they could run their coal plants more inexpensively. Now in Maine, we made a decision 25 years ago that our utilities would be out of the business of making and selling electricity. So already our ability to control that mix is limited, but our system, governed by our PUC, currently working on how to better interconnect our system to renewable energy providers, and that's what I do. The bulk of what I do on a daily basis is work with solar energy providers, trying to interconnect them with the grid. There is nothing about Pine Tree Power that's going to make that any better. Most of my clients actually have to pay for that infrastructure to attach to the grid. So the idea that Pine Tree Power makes it better is weak. The better opportunity is investments by politicians are likely to cut back on making our system greener, which is why we can't go with Pine Tree Power.
Okay, well, Al, how would you respond to that? Also, attorneys I know and have talked to at Natural Resources Defense Council in New York aren't aware of any evidence that consumer-owned utilities are better than investor-owned utilities when it comes to climate. What's your evidence on that?
It's very unsurprising to me that our current investor-owned utilities have poured over $35 million into this election to mislead us. They're owned by gas companies. The Yes on Question 3 campaign is endorsed by Sierra Club, Maine Climate Action Now, Maine Youth for Climate Justice, the National Resources Council of Maine, Sunrise Movement, 350.org, A Climate to Thrive. I could just keep going with all of the climate and environmental groups that are behind Yes on Question 3. And it's because the first 6 communities in this country to get to 100% renewable energy were all consumer-owned utility. The investor-owned utilities that we have right now are homed in Calgary. CMP's parent company has ownership from BlackRock. They have an incentive to make us not invest in renewable energy. Pine Tree Power Company has a mandate and the company purpose in the bill to improve our ability to invest in renewable energy. A Climate to Thrive, an energy independent organization fighting for our climate future, and MDI, was working with Versant Power for years to improve solar interconnection. They took money from them. This spring, their board voted to send that money back and to focus all of their time on how we pass Question 3, because they have seen Versant and CMP be our biggest obstacles towards building the grid of our future, the grid that's needed for my generation. Because the investor and utilities are never going to find it profitable to do what we need to do in order to build a resilient and renewable energy friendly grid.
And you need to wrap up.
Fantastic. CMP settled in the last few years $700,000 for dragging their feet in the state legislature around solar. These utilities are willing to pay millions of dollars in fines for violating the law because they know they continue making profit off of us staying with dirty energy.
Thank you. I'm going to have one more question before we turn to each of you questioning each other for a little bit. I want to talk about outages because that's been discussed as well. Al, I'm going to start with you this time. And I know I sound like a lawyer when I say, what's your evidence? But I'm going to sound like a lawyer, sorry. To back up, again, there are a lot of claims back and forth in these campaigns. What evidence do you have that we're going to have the same number of trees, we're, according to Pine Tree Power, going to have essentially the same line workers and others? Why should we expect fewer outages with Pine Tree Power as opposed to Central Maine Power and Versant?
Right now, we've got the worst outages in the country, and it's not just because of the trees. Most of Maine's trees are in the places of the state where people aren't living. So I keep hearing that from the opposition. I'm like, I don't think that's right. We know from the American Public Power Association that consumer-owned utilities have far more reliable power than investor-owned utilities. Mr. Cohen showed a slide. I don't know if y'all picked it up. They were picking up data from rural electric co-ops, not the full picture of consumer-owned utilities across the country, because they've got far better reliability, and they don't want you to know that. Let's look at Eastern Maine Electric Co-op, which, as Mr. Cohen mentioned, has represented some of the most rural parts of the state. They've got 3.5 times more line per ratepayer than anyone in Versant territory. And yet, over the last 5 years, their power has been far more reliable, and when it goes off, it goes back on in a much quicker time. And this is because they actually have workers that are accountable to their community. Pine Tree Power will be able to invest in the infrastructure we need to make sure we don't have as many outages by hardening wires, by increasing tree trimming, by building the small-scale steps that we know we need for infrastructure that is decaying. We have not been investing in the wires in Maine because the utilities do not find it profitable. The utilities right now make their money with big, large-scale projects that aren't necessarily serving our interest, meaning the things that we can do to improve reliability, like building microgrids, which is what we're seeing in northern rural Vermont right now, where their utilities are investing in solar arrays and batteries for the areas that have some of the worst outages. That's not going to be invested in by CMP because they're not accountable to us, and we have no control over the decisions their boards are
And I'll
making.
need you to wrap up.
Thank you.
You're already wrapped up?
Get it.
Jim?
So I think it's important to understand what are the relevant analogies, and picking analogies for small municipal systems is not a relevant example. You need to look at large rural utilities. And so the slide that's there, unfortunately you can't read it all, I'm not quite sure why, but the top bar, that the most reliable are those small those small kind of urban consumer-owned utilities. The least reliable are the large rural ones. And so that's why I pointed to that data. What Pine Tree Power will talk about is those small urban consumer-owned utilities. They also leave out the consumer-owned island utilities, which have among the worst reliability in Maine. And yes, if you look at Eastern Maine Electric Cooperative, it has consistently had worse reliability than Central Maine Power. And if you look at similar ones that exist in New Hampshire and Vermont, you'll find the same result. Let's look at the two relevant examples of this exact model, which is Long Island and Puerto Rico. Look at those examples, and what you'll find is the kind of finger pointing, the kind of lack of investment. Those are the same concerns that former public utilities commissioners have about a lack of investment in the system. It's what we see with many of our public infrastructure. We don't have enough teachers. We're not hiring the rural police we need. Even though these are all authorized in budgets, we're not spending that money. And to put control in the hands of a government entity that struggles to be able to make the investments and expect more reliability, that's why our public advocate also said there was nothing in question 3 that guaranteed more reliability. If it was so important, put it in the bill, but frankly, our law already says utility service must be safe and adequate and reliable. That's in the law today.
Time to wrap up.
So for these reasons, to expect and predict the future, that putting together a private grid operator we don't know with politicians we don't know and expect that suddenly our system is more reliable is fantasy thinking.
Thank you. And just as a point of information before we go, because Jim had that slide up there, and I know there were some parts of it missing, but from the New York State Commission's report on the Long Island Public Authority from April 2023, the data they found was that for outages where there are not major events, coastal or non-coastal, they broke it down, publicly owned utilities were better than investor-owned utilities, but with major events, investor-owned utilities were better where there were coastal outages or whatever. So again, there's some mixed information, but data, but again, I urge people to take a look at things if they choose. So we are now moving to the portion of the forum where we, by agreement earlier, I think Jim is asking the first question of Al, who then will respond with a question to Jim.
Thank you, and appreciate the change to the new format. I think this is the first time.
So
this is the first time Al and I have had the opportunity to ask each other questions. So we'll see how it goes. I think earlier, Al, you mentioned something along the lines that whatever the cost was of the takeover, there would still be $9 billion in savings, no matter what it costs. I guess, how can we be so confident that there are going to be savings when we actually don't know what that purchase price will be? And if you're able to share what you think that purchase price would be, that would be great, and tell us how you got there.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. As I stated earlier, the Maine independent economic analysis, the only economic analysis that wasn't paid for about the transition to Pine Tree Power, uses a 1.5 multiplier. I think that's high. I don't think there's any chance we're going to pay 1.5 because we have the precedent of Emera selling to Versant using the 1.4 multiplier. And they were a much more functional utility than Central Maine Power has been. I don't understand what business that has been ranked dead last in customer satisfaction, that has shown over and over again poor service to Maine people, would ever be appraised for twice its worth. That makes no sense to me. And so I believe that the figure will be much less than 1.5, but even if it is 1.5, that's where that $9 billion in savings comes from. And it's because what we're doing here is we're actually investing in long-term equity for future generations, for my generation. I'm 25. After 30 years of Pine Tree Power saving us money, I'll be 55. And then we will fully own the grid. And I can imagine extreme weather is only going to be increasing, and we'll be dealing with the highest impacts of this climate crisis. But because we're not going to be having to spend so much money in shareholder profit, we'll actually be able to build a grid that can respond to that and can figure out what our next best path is towards building the just transition to a clean energy economy that we need.
Al, you get to ask a question of Jim.
So exciting. I have heard the end of your presentation, you said something along the lines of we'll be putting control of our utility in the hands of people we don't know. Can you tell us who's on the boards of CMP's parent company, Avangrid, and Versant's parent company, Enmax? Who's in control of our utility right now, and how much do those board members get paid?
So as a starting point, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't represent CMP, never have, don't represent Versant. So I have no idea who those people are. They all have local boards that serve locally in Maine. The people who are out working on our lines every day are our friends and neighbors. They're members of the IBEW union. And the IBEW union has looked at this plan and said, we're much more comfortable with the system we have, with the people we know. And we do know who the people here in Maine are. We know who the executives are. They are our friends and neighbors. If we switch to Pine Tree Power, we will be electing a board. And you and I will each elect one of those members. We will have no control over the remaining 12. And we've seen that elections have consequences. We've seen that there can be gridlock that is created by the sort of tribal mentality that we now see in politics in America and frankly increasingly in Maine. And we'd be handing control over to that group of people who every 2 years will face election again. In fact, if you look at the districts that these folks would serve in, that's what it looks like. So we would each be in one of those districts, elect one of those people, and their only qualifications would be they're 21 years of age, and they live in the district. And they, in turn, would appoint 6 more people. Collectively, those 6 people have to have some expertise. But the way question 3 is phrased, if one person had all of that financial and technical abilities, the other 5 wouldn't need any of it.
Jim, you'll need to wrap up.
So I guess the last thing I would say is, I currently serve as the board chair of the Northern New England Passenger Rail Authority. I was appointed by the governor and confirmed by the legislature. There's no confirmation process. There's no control over those last remaining 6, and that should have all of us concerned.
All right, Jim, you get a question to Al now.
Great. So we've spent a lot of time talking about for-profit companies and companies that are not in the state of Maine or companies that are foreign. But yet, we have a proposal in front of us that allows our grid operator to be either a for-profit company or a foreign company. If this was such an important thing to the Pine Tree Power campaign, why didn't you write your bill to prohibit either of those things?
Thank you for that question. I am a grassroots community organizer because I believe in democracy. I believe that Maine people have a right to the things that we need to live every day, and our electricity is one of them. I believe we deserve to have the ability to make decisions about our power. And that's why I'm in support of us getting away from the monopoly we have right now with corporate and foreign government control, creating a power company that we are the decision makers, we are the owners. That is ultimately the biggest concern for me and for a lot of folks behind the Yes on Question 3 campaign. I also believe that the free market will protect us. And that's not what we have right now with our investor-owned utilities. They have a guaranteed monopoly, meaning there is no protection, there is no competition, there's no ability for us to actually make sure we're getting the best service. And as ratepayers, we're seeing that. I don't know about you all, but I've spent time on CMP trying to get customer service. It's like 6 to 8 hours right now. It's a ridiculous amount of time before I can talk to someone. And it's because when they were bought up by Avangrid, which is owned by Iberdrola, this large, enormous European energy conglomerate, they sent a lot of their customer service workers out of Maine. A lot of them are based in Rochester, New York, where Avangrid also owns a utility there. There's a whole group of citizens and people who've been fighting to transition to consumer-owned utility there. In New Mexico, Avangrid's tried to buy that utility as well, and there's hundreds of people who have been fighting that purchase.
And you'll need to wrap up in
Fantastic.
15 seconds.
What we see is that these utilities, because they make so much money, can pour an enormous amount in lobbying and campaigning against our interest.
Thanks.
So-
Before we go to your question to Jim, which will be the last one back and forth between you two, we will then turn to the audience. So folks in the audience, there'll be 2 people, I believe, who will have microphones. They're standing in the back, and so that, one in each corner, so that if you do have a question, please raise your hand, and we want to alternate if a questioner is for the referendum, and then somebody who's against, so we can have sort of a back and forth. Be a little challenging for me to moderate, but, and we'll see if you have questions, and if we still have time left over, I may have a few more. But Al, a question to Jim.
So I've got 2 more questions for
You
Jim.
get 1 more, I believe, right? I think we've been going back and forth.
I think Jim started asking me questions.
You did, so
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4.
You've asked 1, I've asked 2.
Yeah, so you get to ask 1 to be 2 and 2.
Great, fantastic.
You were challenging my math there, but
Sorry, thank you so much. I want to ask about a question about CMP's unprecedented spending in this campaign. I understand your comment that you don't work for CMP. It is my understanding you work for Maine Affordable Energy that is funded solely by CMP's parent company, Avangrid. As you know, question 2 that we're voting on this fall would put an end to the type of spending that CMP and Versant are doing in this election, put an end to spending for foreign governments on our ballot initiative. What is your client, Maine Affordable Energy's position on question 2? And why did Maine Affordable Energy's funder, CMP, lobby against it in the legislature this spring, as reported by Maine Public?
So I guess I would start by saying I have not paid a moment's attention to question 2. Maine Affordable Energy has not been involved in question 2, and I can't answer the question about why others have engaged in question 2. But if we're going to talk about campaign spending, I think the first thing to understand is this is an extraordinary ballot question. Think about it. We're going to be going to the polls and casting a vote to take over by eminent domain 2 private companies. When have we ever done something like that before? That's never happened in any other state. If somebody were coming to take your home and offering you less than what it was worth, you'd fight that. And so the fact that Avangrid and NMAX are out spending money on a campaign to literally save their companies shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Pine Tree Power brought us this campaign. They put in front of the voters that we would have this choice. There's really no other way to educate hundreds of thousands of Mainers other than engaging in a campaign. That's how our system works. And they're not spending any of your money on it. They're spending their own money on it. They didn't ask anyone else to spend any money on it either. But they did go out and assemble a coalition. And that coalition includes the IBEW, the AFL-CIO, the BIW unions, the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, water and consumer-owned sewer and water districts. You know what? Governor Mills and Governor LePage don't agree on many things, but they agree Pine Tree Power is a bad idea. 12,000 Mainers signed individual pledge cards opposing question 3. That's more than 6 times as many individuals who contributed to the Pine Tree Power campaign. I think one of the real stories is why did so few people write checks to contribute to the Pine Tree Power campaign? To some degree, that's called voting with your feet. That Mainers don't think it's a good idea to take over by eminent domain by their utilities. And when people come along and say, spend $13.5 billion to take over your utilities and somehow it's going to save money, we don't believe that.
Thank you. At this time, we'll open it up for audience questions. And if you do have a question, please raise your hand. Sorry, I'm moving so that I can see. We have somebody over there, and the microphone is heading your way. And if you could indicate to whom you are addressing your question, that would be great. Thank you. Mic on.
So my question is kind of neutral. It's information. And whoever wants to answer it, please do. I am not a lawyer, and I'm wondering, all these legal questions, is it about the multiplier? Is it about eminent domain? Is it about both? What are the likely lawsuits? That's number one. And number two, on behalf of the League of Women Voters, I just want to say there is a card out in front with nonpartisan information about all 8 ballot questions. So take the card, it'll send you to a website. So, thank you.
Yeah, I would love to start there.
Okay, go ahead and start, and then Jim.
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you for plugging the League of Women Voters of Maine. I worked for the League, and it was some of the best education I could ever receive, and we are so, so lucky to have them in our state. And I'm not a lawyer either. I'm a community organizer, but I'm surrounded by young people, energy experts, lawyers, business owners, all fighting for the yes on question 3 side. The process in the idea that there's going to be years of litigation is one of the many myths the utilities are pouring down our throats. The process for what the acquisition will look like is actually really clearly laid out in the policy. Once we win in November, the first year after, we will have an election for the 7 board members of the Pine Tree Power Company. They'll then appoint their 6. They will then have a couple steps that are outlined here, and there's a handout there, all written in the policy. but they'll make an initial offer to CMP and Versant for an acquisition price. If that decision can't be negotiated by those two parties, then the Maine courts will be the ultimate arbiter of the price of the utilities. It was known that the utilities are going to contest what the acquisition will be, of course. That's why we have to have a neutral party, our court system, decide what the fair market value. Pine Tree Power has been proven to be constitutional by the Maine Public Utilities Commission's own study, and it passed through the Maine legislature. You'll notice when you get the ads from CMP and Versant that they're not telling you that this is unconstitutional or illegal. They can't tell you that because this is constitutional. We're guaranteed this right in the Maine Constitution to say we do not want these utilities serving us anymore. We want to build a company that works for us. It absolutely, the acquisition price will have to go through the Maine courts, and that's why it was really laid out in what this transition looks like.
All right, thank you. And Jim, if you could also address, then answer the question, but and you might as well keep the slide up, Al, for the, you have 2027. Jim, I think you've got 2031 or so. There's about 4 years difference. What would the litigation actually be about?
Thanks. It's important to understand that the slide that you're looking at is sort of like starting with the introduction in chapter 1 and then skipping to the conclusion at the end, because what you don't see in this slide is the litigation. Somehow an offer is made, we're billions of dollars apart. We just heard that it's going to go to the courts. That takes time. I mentioned earlier I worked with two small water companies in the mid-1990s. One was the Rangeley Water Company, one was the Winter Harbor Water Company. Each one of those cases had no constitutional challenge. They chose not to challenge constitutionality, but they challenged valuation. Those two small water companies, 3.5 years of litigation. Now magnify that statewide. Magnify that to billions of dollars. Two utilities, not just one, and litigation has taken longer over the last 25 years, not less. None of us can say for sure what the results of that litigation would be. Anyone who tries to tell you what the results of the litigation will be is not telling you the truth. However, we can have educated guesses about what that litigation might look like and how long it would last. 5 years is reasonable. Our public advocate said, on average, 5 to 10 years. In fact, on average, it's been 10 years. Long Island Power was 13 years without litigation. So we will be in court for a long time. Meanwhile, we're going to be fighting about who owns the grid. We're not going to be talking about reliability. We're not going to be talking about climate change. The governor's 2030 climate plan comes and goes because we're going to be in court. And think about it. Every little substation, every little wire is now something that we're going to be fighting about in court. All the motions. As a lawyer, I can tell you, it is going to be extensive litigation. We're going to be paying for that in our rates for years. So that's not anything that's fear-mongering anyway, it's reality. That's what happened in Boulder, Colorado. One small town spent $28 million over 10 years before finally giving up. Now, the other thing is to say that there's no constitutional problem. How many lawsuits have we had over ballot questions in recent years over constitutionality, and that involved overturning the results of ballot questions? There will be a lawsuit on constitutionality. And the question is going to be, is it necessary for the state of Maine to exercise eminent domain to take over two private companies under the unclear promise of better rates, the unclear promise of better service? That is going to be a real question that will go to federal court, and that's one more thing that we'll be fighting about in courts.
Thank you. And just point of information before we go to the next question, if somebody could bring the microphone over to that person, and then we've got another over here and there, I see, is that at state court level, because I am a lawyer, so it would first go to a referee, which would be appointed by the court, who would make a recommendation. It would then go to the Maine Superior Court for hearing on that recommendation, and any party who doesn't like whatever the Superior Court judge says could then appeal it to the Maine Supreme Court. That would be the state process. So next question, please.
Yes, and I wonder if both Al and Jim could answer this. It was brought up by Al, but I'm curious as to why our current utility rates skyrocketing if they're currently regulated by the PUC?
All right, we'll start with Jim and then Al.
Let me just find,
Thank you.
if I could find my slide and then start.
These guys are good. They're whipping through these. You're getting practice. Whoops.
All right, there we go. There's a slide that hopefully addresses the question. So the question is, why are our rates skyrocketing if our utilities are regulated? The first thing to understand is our rates have been skyrocketing in recent years, and the orange bar on your slide are the supply rates. That's the electricity itself. And for the last 25 years, our utilities are not allowed to make electricity or sell electricity. So all of those major rate increases that occurred are unrelated to CMP, unrelated to Versant. They simply collect the money and pass it on to the people who do make the electricity. Those rates are set by an auction that happens once a year. We're going to have a new auction probably sometime in November to set new prices in the new year. We don't know what they'll be, but they will have nothing to do with CMP and Versant. They'll have nothing to do with Pine Tree Power. That is the single biggest part of your rates. The other thing to understand is only about 13% of your current bill is even impacted by Pine Tree Power. 87% is not. And so the last thing I would say is there have been increases on the transmission side, which are the regional rates set by New England. And according to a PUC study, any changes in cost will have a very minimal effect on transmission rates. Those are set by the federal government because of the way New England shares the cost of those big overhead lines. The final piece are the distribution rates, which are set by the Maine PUC. And if you look on average, they have increased this past year. That increase was over the course of the last, say, 10 years, in line with inflation. We've had a substantial amount of inflation. Our taxes have gone up, our groceries have gone up. It stands to reason that we have to pay workers more, so that our costs have gone up. So they've gone up on the distribution side, but they've gone up in line with inflation and what you'd expect. It's the supply rate that CMP and Versant have no control over.
Thanks. Al?
Absolutely. As Mr. Cohen mentioned, the current investor-owned utilities, CMP and Versant, continue to be approved for distribution rate hikes by the Maine Public Utilities Commission, even though we're all struggling with the increase on the supply side. Pine Tree Power isn't going to be impacting the standard offer. It's absolutely true. It will be impacting distribution and transmission. And in a time where we are so uncertain and seeing such high supply costs, we need to figure out how to save as much money as possible on distribution and transmission. Why do we have a Public Utilities Commission that's approving those rate hikes for us, even though those utilities are taking $187 million in profit? They don't need to be taking more than that, and we shouldn't have to be paying for that in our bills. We also know that if we have any chance of actually getting our supply cost to be cheaper, by investing in renewable energy, by expanding the infrastructure of our grid. Why would we want to do that with the investor-owned utilities that are getting the 9 to 12% guaranteed rate of return when we can access low-interest financing for building out our grid and figuring out what it looks like to increase solar and wind so the cost of electricity goes down? CMP and Versant are not going to, tell you about all of the ways that we could be saving money. They're actually going to fight up against energy efficiency bills in the legislature. They're going to lobby and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to make sure our bills keep going up so they can keep making more and more money off of Mainers. What we see
You'll need to wrap up.
Great.
15 seconds.
Great. What we see in Maine is that we've got regulatory capture, where right now we have a revolving door of people who work as lawyers for the investor-owned utilities and then go to be our very regulators. And I have seen, and many people, Mainers have seen, that that system is not working for us.
Thank you. Our next questioner here, and then we have in the back there will be the next one, or in the two-thirds of the way.
Is there anything that we can learn from the transmission prices of other utilities in Maine that are owned by the public? I'm not talking about islands, I'm talking about Kennebunk Light and Power and other companies that are mainland companies owned by the public. How do their transmission rates fare compared to CMP and Verizon?
You go ahead, and then Jim.
What we know from the Office of the Public Advocate, who reviewed and released a fact sheet about question 3, is that Maine can expect to see massive transmission savings. Because as Mr. Cohen mentioned, right now, we've got to share the transmission costs with New England states. But when we're able to invest in transmission at such a low interest rate, the Public Advocate and the Federal Energy Regulatory Committee, the federal regulatory body, has stated that we wouldn't have to share those rates, meaning that there's a projected $4 billion in savings that Maine people would see. This is enormous savings. We also know that the mainland consumer-owned utilities in Maine have rates that are 52% less than what we're paying as CMP and Versant customers. I think that, there's the idea that the islands cost more money. That's absolutely true. The consumer-owned utilities that are on islands are a bit more expensive, cost a lot of money to get to the islands. But talk to your friends and neighbors in Kennebunk Light and Power. Talk to your friends who are served by Madison Electric or Holton, and they will tell you that their bills are a fraction of the cost of what CMP or Versant are charging their ratepayers.
All right, Jim.
So thank you for the question, and I have a two-part answer. So the first part of the answer is the comparability of small utilities like Kennebunk to Pine Tree Power. And what's important to understand is they look nothing alike. Starting with, Pine Tree Power will have a private grid operator that will charge us $82 million a year more. Kennebunk Light and Power doesn't have a private grid operator. Kennebunk Light and Power doesn't have transmission lines. Kennebunk Light and Power is not required to offer net energy billing or long-term energy contracts, so they don't have stranded costs. Kennebunk Light and Power doesn't pay property taxes, they don't pay income taxes. These are all major differences. I was on a panel with the general manager of the Kennebunk Light and Power District who said if we had to scale up to serve all of York County, we couldn't offer the same value proposition because they have 7 line workers and 44 line miles. It doesn't look anything alike. If you want to look at the second question, which is the transmission rates, this is a shell game. And the $9 billion of savings come from a shell game where what supporters want to do is charge the rest of New England as though CMP and Versant still own the grid, an inflated price, ask the rest of New England to pay that inflated price, use the windfall to come back to Maine and lower our rates. And if you think Massachusetts and Connecticut are going to stand for paying for that windfall, you have another thing coming. There is nobody out there, including the Public Utilities Commission that did that study that guaranteed that. And I can tell you, the Public Advocate said there's a chance that that might happen, but the Public Advocate has also been clear that he doesn't know whether that's going to happen or not. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. What's behind door number 3? Will we get that windfall and make Pine Tree Power something that's cost effective? Or much more likely, we won't get that windfall and Pine Tree Power will be much more expensive because of that shell game that we won't allow to happen. Long Island Power Authority,
Jim.
Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority are the analogous questions. They have high rates and poor service.
Al. Oh, sorry, we already had you. Sorry, I'm losing track of who's answering here who. So next question was the gentleman
Yes.
right there. You got the mic.
I have to say I'm quite puzzled by the attention that Puerto Rico is getting. It seems that they're in a very different position from us in Maine, from any mainland continental United States utility. Why? Because they're an island in the Caribbean and they have a huge hurricane problem. If we think of the destruction there that has taken place over the last 10 years, you'll understand what I'm getting at. I really don't think that power...
Yeah.
My question is, I would like to hear more about Long Island. What have they done well? What have they done poorly? Thank you.
Okay. Jim and then Al.
Great, thank you so much for the question. I am going to start with Puerto Rico because that was the start of your question. And first say, only those two utilities in America look like Pine Tree Power. So they are the only analogous situations. We don't know for sure, and I wouldn't stand in front of you and say, it is guaranteed that because Long Island or Puerto Rico look a certain way, that absolutely assures that that's how Pine Tree Power will be. These are only analogies that we can look at. Now, Puerto Rico has hurricanes, Maine has trees. 87% of outages in Maine come from trees falling on wires. 82% of them come from trees outside of the right-of-way that our utilities don't have any rights to trim. So whether it's Pine Tree Power or whether it's Central Maine Power, we'll still have trees. And there is a correlation between trees and outages. We are the most forested state in the nation. So there are different situations. But I think one analogy you can draw from both Puerto Rico and Long Island is the separation of the political control and the private company that operates the grid, where you have a challenge of will the elected leaders provide the resources needed to address the outages. A couple weeks ago, our public advocate came out and said, Central Maine Power should not have restored power after the Christmas storm in 4 days.
15 seconds, Jim.
The public advocate said they should have restored power in 8 days, slower. Political leadership has said it's cheaper to restore power slower. Central Maine Power spent their own money to put the lights on faster than we expected. They actually did so for less money. But these are the kinds of risks that occur when you separate the political leadership from the people who actually operate the grid.
Thank you, Al.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question about Long Island. Long Island voted in 1998 to transition to public ownership. And even though they were handed a terrible deal by the Republican governor that made a deal with the outgoing investor-owned utility where they had to acquire a dead nuclear power plant, they still were able to drop rates by 20% on day one. Even in a terrible, terrible circumstances, people in Long Island saved money. This is one of the best examples for Pine Tree Power because it shows even if the investor-owned utilities are right that this is going to be a challenging process, which I'm certain is a lie, but let's pretend it's right, we will still see savings and increased reliability. LIPA, Long Island Power Authority, also during Superstorm Sandy, had multiple situations that happened from that extreme weather. They had $1 billion that they got in federal assistance because unlike investor-owned utilities, publicly owned utilities are able to qualify for federal emergency aid, meaning that cost didn't get passed on to their ratepayers like it would for us if we had a terrible storm and CMP and Versant would pass on those rates to us as ratepayers. Consumer-owned utilities can access that federal assistance. They can access low-interest financing, meaning they can save people money. And if you don't want to trust me, a campaign organizer, go look up transitions to consumer-owned utility and the path about how all of them have saved people money.
Thank you. And before we go to our last question, because I'm going to try to keep us toward 8:30, and then if people have questions of our speakers afterwards, welcome to. But really lightning round, I'm going to use my moderator hook here. We've talked about Long Island and Puerto Rico, but at least one or two of the slides, and earlier in this campaign, I heard a lot about Nebraska. Haven't heard as much tonight. Nebraska, tell me why Nebraska isn't a more relevant parallel than, say, Puerto Rico to the question. It has elected boards generally, nonpartisan, very reliable service, low rates, only red state to have utilities set at 2025, net zero carbon goal, and it's increasing its renewable percentage, while it is still, to Jim's point, slightly a majority coal and nuclear. So each of you talk to Nebraska. How is it relevant or not relevant for information's sake? Jim, start, and then Al.
Great. About 4 years ago, the only Democratic commissioner on the Nebraska Public Utilities Commission came to Maine and talked about how Nebraska, as a state with predominantly consumer-owned utilities, and it's a patchwork of them, it's not one large one, they make trade-offs. The trade-off is they run for office. The spending that occurs on the races for office has been going up, and they tend to want to lower rates, which means there's pressure to invest less. And one of the concerns that consumer-owned water utilities had about investment by Pine Tree Power is, were those elected officials going to have pressure not to make those investments in reliability? They experience that directly. In Nebraska, they have on paper a goal to get greener, but the reality is they are mostly coal. And they've stayed that way because it's less expensive. And unlike Maine, they're an integrated utility, vertically integrated, where they own the generation sources as well. Those utilities are part of a national trade association that has gone out and opposed clean energy plans.
About 15 seconds.
So Nebraska finally doesn't have a utility that looks like Pine Tree Power. Pine Tree Power has a private grid operator. Pine Tree Power is in a state with a bunch of trees. Nebraska has very few trees, and they don't have a private grid operator.
Al?
There are similarities and differences with Nebraska's model. What stands out to me is that even they've got constant tornadoes, are able to maintain some of the fewest power outages in the country with some of the cheapest rates. They're, as Jeff mentioned, the only Republican-led state that has been able to set a net zero clean energy goal, because that wasn't set by their legislators, it was set by their elected board members of their utilities. What we've got difference with Pine Tree Power here in Maine, very proud of, is we'll have clean elections and ranked choice voting for people who run for the Pine Tree Power Board, meaning we also aren't in control of the generation. We're not going to have coal who's fueling our elections, because they can get funded by us, meaning we can have the most brilliant working people run to represent us, to be accountable to us at our power company. But Nebraska shows us that having a statewide public ownership model can work, and can work to increase service and what people need is in terms of reliability and affordable rates. But what we see with the investor-owned utility model is that we get none of that. So in even the most conservative climates across the country, we can see that public ownership is working to deliver people the power they deserve.
All right, we have time for one last question, I'm told by Tom, and is there one? Sorry, we have two hands, but we only get one question, or three hands. Wait, did he already ask a question or no?
No,
sorry.
he did.
Okay. Twins, go ahead.
And we're not plotting together.
All right.
For the vote yes, lady, Al, if I may, in one of your earlier slides, you had 3 bullet points. And candidly, I forget the first one, but it was not complimentary to the power companies. The second one was how 90,000 people had been disconnected. I think they got disconnected because they didn't pay their bill. I'm not sure a $30 a month projected savings would have caused those people to pay their bill, but who knows. The bigger question I had, you said that, thank you, 20% increases. Now, those were approved by the PUC, which is the quasi-governmental public, I'm not sure that's the right way to say it, organization that's supposed to look out for Mainers.
Can you ask the question just to bring it to the point?
Isn't your beef with the PUC? Why wouldn't you exert your efforts to change the PUC as opposed to throwing the entire system out the window and starting with yet another quasi-governmental public board? Seems like the PUC is your beef.
I'm sorry, I can't have you give an opinion. I've got to cut you off with your question. So, Al?
We've been trying as ratepayers, consumers, as working people, for over 100 years to figure out how we can change our regulatory system to hold these investor-owned utilities accountable. We haven't been effective. It's because we have regulatory capture, meaning there's a revolving door of who works for the utilities and then who's supposedly supposed to be regulating us. The people who serve in the Public Utilities Commission, I have the utmost respect and recognize that the system is rigged against them. The utilities can pour hundreds of thousands of dollars in lawyers and lobbying, and yet the only people representing us in front of the Public Utilities Commission is the Office of the Public Advocate. They've got a staff of 4, is my current understanding. Iberdrola has a budget of Iberdrola has a profit for the first half of this year of $2.7 billion. I don't know about you, but those are odds stacked against us. We also know here in Maine that we've got former governors that have gone on to work and serve on Avangrid's board. Former Governor Baldacci, I think, makes about $200,000 a year to go to about 6 board meetings.
About 15.
Mr. Cohen didn't mention that when I asked him a question about who serves on this board. It's the governor that appoints the people who are supposedly holding us accountable and representing us in front of the Public Utilities Commission. We've seen those systems fail us over and over again, which is why we need a utility that we have control over because we elect who serves on that board.
All right, and Jim, you get to a brief response.
So I've been to several debates now, and I've heard statements that can't trust our Public Utilities Commission, you can't trust former governors, heard about politicians who don't have your interest at heart, has been said by my worthy opponent, which begs the question, if we can't trust all these people, why are we setting up a system that puts control of our utilities in the hands of the politicians that we're not supposed to trust in the first place? But I'm very glad that you asked your question about the 94,000 people who are disconnected, because it turns out they're not telling you the whole story. They're required to send a disconnection notice to anyone who hasn't paid their bill. Most of the reasons people are struggling are for rates unrelated to CMP and Versant. Versant and CMP are trying to help them. If they didn't send a disconnection notice, those customers wouldn't be able to access state and federal grant money, so they need to receive that disconnection notice. That doesn't mean they're actually being disconnected. But I'll tell you, when I don't pay my tax bill, I very much can expect that my local government is going to eventually take my property, and if I don't pay my consumer-owned water bill, the same thing is going to happen. And to expect that Pine Tree Power suddenly magically makes that go away is fantasy thinking. The rate increases that were approved, you bet. They were approved after a rigorous process. I showed you my files earlier. They are rigorous. Thousands of data requests, depositions, briefs. Ultimately, it can go to the law court. These things take a long time. Our consumer advocate is a worthy advocate. And there are other parties that participate as well. When rates are set, they reflect ultimately what our government says. To throw everything out for an untested model only in 2 places really strains credibility.
So I said at the outset that we would hold applause till the end, so now you may give applause to both our speakers.